Long before the Slavs had a name, they had a destiny written in their blood. Imagine standing in a mist-covered forest, the same forest where ancient warriors once buried their dead, where whispers of old gods still echo through the trees. You breathe in the cold air, and somewhere beneath your feet lies a secret, not carved into stone, not written in scrolls, but encoded in the cells of the living. That secret is a signature, and for over 300 million people today, it beats quietly in every heartbeat, a thread that binds them across borders, across centuries, across silence. This is the Slavic genome, and it doesn't just tell a story, it remembers one. At the center of that memory is a code, R1a, a Y chromosome haplogroup passed from father to son like a torch. In Western Europe, it's rare, but step into Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and it blazes. In some regions, over 60% of men carry it. That's not just coincidence. That's legacy. That's empire. But R1a is only the beginning. Within it lies a branch, subtle, elusive, and powerful, R1am458, sometimes called the Polish clade. This lineage isn't found in the West. It lives and breathes in Central and Eastern Europe. And when archaeologists dug up Iron Age graves in Poland, they found it there too, as if the soil itself still remembered who once walked it. This isn't mythology. It's the kind of evidence you can't argue with. Ancient bones and living blood matching. The same story, told by silence and science. But the story doesn't stop with the fathers. Look deeper, into the mitochondria, the maternal DNA passed from mother to child, and you find H5A1, U5A2, mitochondrial lineages rooted in Eastern Europe for more than 2,000 years. These are not broad strokes. These are whispers of women who lived and died in villages long since lost to time, but whose descendants still walk the earth, unknowingly carrying their legacy. And then there's the Balkans, where a different signal rises. Not R1a, but I2, especially in Bosnia, Montenegro, parts of Croatia. Here, I2 reaches stunning levels, 60%, even 70% among men. But this isn't a Slavic marker. It's older, pre-Slavic, from Illyrians, Thracians, forgotten tribes who were absorbed, not erased. Because that's the truth Slavic DNA reveals. It didn't dominate by exclusion. It expanded by integration. The Slavic genome isn't pure. It's powerful. A tapestry, woven with the threads of neighbors, rivals, and ancestors. What makes it special isn't isolation. It's the scale of connection. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, from the Carpathians to the Volga, there exists a continuity unlike anything else in Europe. It's not that all Slavs are genetically identical, far from it. But among all the ethnic groups in Europe, the Slavs are bound by a core genetic identity that spreads farther and deeper than almost any other. There's something poetic about it, that a people whose history was shaped by silence, who left few records, who rose in the shadows after Rome, should now be understood not through old books, but through blood. This is a signature you can't forge, a memory that doesn't fade. Slavic DNA carries the voice of people who never wrote a single word, but whose legacy is spelled out in the faces, the bodies, the lineages of millions today. In an age of data and digital noise, the oldest truths remain silent, coded in cells, waiting to be heard. Because genes don't lie, and the Slavic signature is still being written. It didn't begin with a battle. It began with footsteps. Quiet, steady, relentless. From the dark forests north of the Black Sea, where rivers curve like veins through the land, something stirred in the 6th century. Tribes with no empires, no gold, no grand monuments, only the force of movement, began to rise. They did not write their story. They became it. And Europe would never be the same. They were the ancestors of today's Slavs. But back then, they had no name. Only language. Only lineage. And what happened next was not war. It was something deeper. A demographic earthquake. In less than 2 centuries, they expanded farther than Rome ever did. Not with armies, but with families. With children. With generations moving like water through the cracks of a collapsing world. And beneath the ruins of what came before, Gothic kingdoms, Roman outposts, Thracian settlements, the Slavs didn't destroy. They settled. They blended. And in doing so, they quietly rewrote the human geography of an entire continent. But the real story was happening where no historian could see, inside the genes. Archaeologists digging in the Balkans uncovered graves from just before this migration. The DNA, Southern, Mediterranean, Balkan. But move just 1 century ahead, and the change is undeniable. Suddenly, the genetic profile reflects that of Eastern European Slavs. It's as if an ancient wind swept in from the north and rewired the land itself. But what made it so powerful was not violence. It was assimilation on a vast scale. Modern Balkan populations, Serbs, Bulgarians, Bosniaks, Croats, carry up to 60% ancestry from these Slavic newcomers. Not conquerors, but genetic settlers, whose bloodlines flowed like roots into the soil, merging with those already there. The Illyrians, the Thracians, the Romanized locals, all of them still live in fragments, woven into the Slavic whole. One haplogroup, I2a, exploded across the Balkans, likely from a single clan whose genes multiplied in a founder effect so massive it reshaped entire populations. This wasn't drift. It was ignition. Like sparks catching in dry grass, the Slavic genome spread and settled. And while this was happening in the south, something equally profound was unfolding in the north. There, Slavs encountered Baltic tribes, Finno-Ugric groups, and ancient steppe remnants. But instead of clashing, they fused. These encounters left quiet marks in the blood. Haplogroup N in northern Russians, traces of Siberian ancestry, subtle shifts in the maternal line. Each mutation a memory. Across this vast sprawl, from the Adriatic coast to the upper Volga, people spoke different dialects, wore different clothes, worshipped in different ways. But inside their bones, the genetic signal was shockingly consistent. One origin, many faces. Geneticists call this a classic serial founder event, when one small group spreads, and spreads again and again. With every step, their descendants become the foundation of the next village, the next tribe, the next nation. That's why modern Poles, Ukrainians, Slovaks, and even Slovenians, despite all the cultural diversity, still carry the echo of that original Slavic burst. But this story isn't about purity. It's about transformation. Because the Slavic expansion didn't erase history. It absorbed it. From Germanic ghosts in Central Europe to the shepherd kings of the Balkans, from Roman ruins to forgotten Scythians, all of them live on inside the Slavic genome. It is not a wall. It is a mirror. And every reflection shows a piece of what Europe once was and what it became. This was not the rise of a people. It was the creation of a continent's genetic core. And it happened not with swords, but with time. Not in stone, but in blood. Across the map of Europe, the word Slav looks simple. One name, one root. But beneath the surface, that simplicity shatters. What lives in Slavic blood is not one legacy, it is 3. And each tells a different story. To the west, where medieval cathedrals rise in cities like Krakow and Prague, the West Slavs carved their identity between empires. Their genes carry a familiar thread, R1a, yes, but laced with Western echoes. Ancient Celts, Germanic tribes, forgotten pagan kingdoms. In the Polish heartland, one unique signal stands apart, a sub-branch of R1a, known as L260, the so-called Polish clade. You won't find it in Russia. You won't see it in the Balkans. But in southern Poland, it pulses through the population like a buried rhythm, a rare lineage that didn't just survive the shifting borders, it defined them. West Slavs didn't migrate into a vacuum. They collided with what remained of Rome's frontier, of Gothic warbands, of tribal confederacies lost to time. The result? A hybrid, not just of genes, but of resilience. Their DNA clusters between East Slavic homogeneity and the Western European kaleidoscope, marking them as a genetic bridge between past and future. But turn east, to the snow-covered plains and dark rivers of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and you enter another world entirely. Here live the East Slavs. Their genome tells a colder, tighter story, less blended, more ancient. In this eastern zone, a powerful genetic uniformity emerges. R1a surges again, not just in frequency, but in focus, almost as if this branch of Slavic identity froze itself in time, a relic of the original homeland, still pulsing beneath modern skin. Yet even here, the blood is not unmixed. In the far north, near Novgorod and Arkhangelsk, something else stirs. A strange whisper from the Uralic forests. Haplogroup N, a legacy from Finno-Ugric peoples who fished beneath northern lights, long before any Slavic word was spoken. These aren't myths. They're mutations, silent, inherited proof of ancient encounters. But now travel south. Cross the Danube. Climb into the shadowed peaks of the Balkans. And here, the picture changes again. The South Slavs are not a continuation of the East. They are a collision. Their DNA is a storm, Slavic markers crashing into the older bones of the Balkans. Haplogroup I2 rises here, not as a memory, but as a monument. Pre-Slavic Illyrians, Romanized Thracians, forgotten shepherd kings, their bloodlines didn't vanish. They merged. They re-emerged. And now they live again through South Slavic populations, fused with the great Slavic wave that arrived in the 6th century and never left. You can see the imprint even today. In Bosnians, in Serbs, in Montenegrins, their DNA leans both east and south, like a compass trying to remember which way it once pointed. But even within South Slavs, the diversity is staggering. Slovenians near the Alps align more with Austrians than with Bulgarians near the Black Sea. One speaks of Central European fusion, the other of deep Balkan ancestry, shaped by Thracians, Byzantines, even Turkic waves that left faint signatures behind. What makes this all extraordinary is not just the difference, but the connection. Despite their divisions, geographic, cultural, political, these three Slavic groups still carry overlapping cores, shared mutations, common paternal branches, mitochondrial echoes passed from mothers who never knew each other, yet whose descendants speak in the same linguistic rhythm. It's not uniformity that defines Slavic DNA. It's unity through divergence. A genome stretched across space and time, adapting, absorbing, evolving, while still whispering the same origin story beneath the skin. No other European identity is quite like this. It is not a straight line. It is a braided river, three paths winding through centuries, occasionally splitting, sometimes converging, but always flowing forward. And if you trace them all the way back, past the mountains and marshes, beyond the ruins and frontiers, you reach the same beginning. A people with no kings, no cities, just language, fire, and blood, moving through history and becoming it. Europe looks united on the map, one continent, one landmass. But beneath the skin, in the hidden threads of DNA, it tells a different story. One of deep divides, of ancient borders, of invisible frontiers, drawn not by kings, but by genes. And standing along one of the sharpest of those invisible lines are the Slavs. To the west, in the valleys of France and the highlands of Spain, another genetic force dominates, Haplogroup R1b. It traces its path from Neolithic farmers, Celtic tribes, and the western branches of Indo-Europeans. But cross into Slavic lands, and it fades. In its place rises something older, sharper, and more easterly, Haplogroup R1a. A different branch from the same tree, but with a completely different history. This divide, R1a in the east, R1b in the west, marks more than just geography. It marks an ancient divergence in how Europe was formed. And yet, that's just the surface. When scientists mapped the genomes of thousands of Europeans and placed them on a principal component chart, what they found was stunning. Western and Southern Europeans clustered together, drawn by shared ancestry from Neolithic farmers and Mediterranean roots. But Eastern Europeans, and especially Slavs, form a distinct cluster, slightly apart, slightly older, with deeper roots in the Yamnaya steppe pastoralists, whose wagons carved across the grasslands nearly 5,000 years ago. This ancestry, rugged, mobile, and powerful, left its strongest legacy in Slavic DNA. While Italians and Spaniards carry more genes from early agricultural societies who settled the Mediterranean coastlines, Slavic populations hold more steppe warrior blood, more hunter-gatherer traces, and in the case of northern Slavs, even whispers of Siberian genes passed down from Uralic tribes and Arctic foragers. These aren't just numbers. They are identity in molecular form. In Russia, researchers found that northern Russians carry up to 18% Siberian-like ancestry, something almost non-existent in Germans or Dutch. In contrast, Southern Slavs, like Croats and Bulgarians, carry traces of ancient Balkan and even Thracian DNA, absorbed during the Great Migrations. West Slavs, especially Poles, bridge the genetic space, holding more R1a than Western Europeans, but still retaining some R1b from Old Germanic and Celtic neighbors. The result? A gradient, not a wall, but a sliding scale of ancestry, where every kilometer east shifts the genome ever so slightly toward a different past. And yet, what's remarkable is how genetically coherent the Slavic core remains. Despite centuries of war, empire, occupation, and movement, East and West Slavs still cluster together more closely than with their geographic neighbors. A Pole and a Belarusian may speak different dialects, live under different histories, but their genomes still echo from the same ancestral hearth. Compare that to a Spaniard and a German, both Western Europeans, yet genetically more distinct. This coherence doesn't mean isolation. Slavic populations are not sealed boxes. They absorbed and adapted, but through it all, they retained a foundational genetic rhythm, one that's visible in haplogroups, in ancestry components, and in subtle mutations passed from parent to child for generations. Even in phenotype, the contrast emerges. In Northern and Eastern Europe, light skin and blue eyes dominate, driven by genetic adaptations to low UV light. Alleles like SLC24A5 and OCA2 that appear with striking regularity in Slavic populations. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, darker hues persist, the legacy of older, sun-bathed civilizations. Then there's lactase persistence, the ability to digest dairy into adulthood. While common across Europe, its frequencies still show patterns. Higher in northwestern Europe, moderate in Slavs, lower in the Balkans. These aren't cultural, they're evolutionary, shaped by ancient survival strategies. But here's what makes Slavic DNA truly unique. It doesn't exist outside the European spectrum. It exists at its eastern frontier. It is the anchor point between West and steppe, between farmer and forager, between the settled and the nomadic. It holds more Indo-European ancestry than most of the continent, and yet it carries with it the traces of every people it ever encountered and never forgot. While some European identities were forged in cities, in courts, in written law, the Slavic genome was shaped by distance, persistence, and movement. It doesn't shout, it endures. So when you look at the genetic map of Europe, don't just see colors. See history, see migrations, see convergence. And know this, wherever the Slavic DNA spreads, it brings with it not just the past of one people, but the memory of an entire half of Europe that walked a different path and left a trail in blood. What if your DNA carried not just the face of your ancestors, but their illnesses, their strengths, even their height? In the heart of Eastern Europe, where dense forests once shielded villages from invading armies, and generations lived and died on the same land for centuries, something extraordinary began to take shape in the blood. A genetic imprint, not just of origin, but of health, of vulnerability, and strangely of height. The Slavic genome, vast and widespread, carries with it a unique pattern, not one born of diversity, but of founder effects, a rare event where a small group multiplies rapidly, carrying with them mutations, both good and bad, that begin to echo across generations. One such echo is silent, invisible, and deadly, a mutation in the NBN gene, causing a condition known as Nijmegen breakage syndrome. Most people have never heard of it, but in Slavic countries, it's part of the genetic landscape. A tiny deletion in the DNA strand, just 5 base pairs gone, and the result is a life-threatening disorder that traces back to a single common ancestor. This mutation is so consistent, so geographically focused, that scientists call it simply the Slavic mutation. But that's just one thread in a larger web. In Eastern Europe, one particular variant of the BRCA1 gene, known as 5382NC, appears again and again in women from Poland, Russia, Ukraine. It carries with it a shadow, a drastically increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Yet it also tells a story of a shared past, of DNA that traveled with the first Slavic migrations, of a burden quietly passed from mother to daughter for over 1,000 years. And then there's Wilson's disease, a rare disorder of copper metabolism. In Spain, it's barely known. In Western Europe, It's scattered. But in Slavic populations, one mutation, his 1069 GLN, appears with startling regularity. In Poland alone, over 70% of patients carry this exact mutation. It didn't spread by chance. It spread with people, with marriages, with survival. These aren't isolated anomalies. Geneticists have cataloged over 50 known founder mutations that recur across Slavic groups, subtle errors in the genetic code that tell a single, resounding truth. The Slavic genome is deeply connected, deeply inherited, and deeply exposed. But the story doesn't end with disease, because there's another pattern hidden in these genes, one far more visible. Height. In the mountainous Dinaric region, Bosnia, Montenegro, parts of Croatia, something remarkable happens. Young men, measured by thousands, consistently rank among the tallest on Earth. Their average height? 185 to 188 centimeters, equal to, and in some regions surpassing, the famously tall Dutch. And this isn't just nutrition. It's not just luck. It's in the blood. Specifically, in a Y chromosome haplogroup called I2, the same marker that dominates the male lineages of South Slavs. In these regions, up to 70% of men carry it. And when scientists cross-referenced haplogroup distribution with height data across Europe, a powerful correlation emerged. Where I2 thrives, so does stature. It's not that I2 causes height, but it marks a gene pool, a legacy that does. A gene pool shaped by thousands of years of selection, isolation, and perhaps even environmental pressure. The mountains, after all, favor resilience. And sometimes, resilience stands tall. Elsewhere in the Slavic world, phenotypes echo similar stories. High frequencies of genes tied to light skin and blue eyes, common markers for lactase persistence, even the regional spread of rare metabolic traits. All of it layered like sediment, historical, biological, unspoken. Slavic populations didn't just pass down language. They passed down traits. And sometimes, those traits carried a cost. That's why medical geneticists in these countries don't just study illness, they study inheritance. They look at the genome not just as a tool, but as a biological time machine, one that reveals how famine, migration, war, and isolation shape the body, the blood, and the future. Because the Slavic genome is not just a history of expansion, it is a living record of how a people survived. And hidden inside that record is a blueprint of what they gained and what they risked. When we hear the word Slavs, we imagine one people, one culture, one origin. But the truth is far more intricate. Because Slavic DNA isn't a closed book. It's a woven manuscript, written across landscapes, rewritten by migrations, and still unfolding with every generation. It doesn't follow a single thread. It spins 1,000, pulled from tribes who vanished, languages that died, and bloodlines that were never meant to meet. That's what makes it beautiful. At first glance, the numbers suggest unity. Genetic clustering, similar haplogroups, overlapping maternal lines. But step closer, and the unity begins to shimmer. It's not a single note. It's a chord. In the Polish lowlands, Slavic markers blend quietly with ancient Germanic imprints. In western Ukraine, the genome still remembers Scythian cavalry riding in the wind. In southern Russia, echoes of Finno-Ugric voices stir beneath modern Slavic skin. And in the Balkans, the fusion is volcanic. Illyrian, Roman, Thracian, Slavic, Byzantine, all pressed into one lineage like layers of sediment in an ancient gorge. And yet, despite all this complexity, the Slavic identity holds. Why? Because what we call Slavic is not a genetic code. It's a genetic canvas, and every population painted on it added its own color, its own brushstroke. Over centuries, those brushstrokes began to blend. They didn't erase each other. They enhanced each other. The early Slavs who left the Dnieper basin did not replace the people they met. They wove themselves into them. Each new region didn't dilute the genome, it diversified it. And yet, despite this variation, something at the core stayed steady. Something deeper than geography. Something older than kingdoms. Across all Slavic peoples, from Czechs to Serbs, from Russians to Bulgarians, the genetic signatures reflect a balance between preservation and adaptation. They share key paternal lineages like R1a, yes. But more than that, they share the story of convergence. In Western Europe, populations often reflect deep separations: Celtic versus Latin, Norse versus Anglo-Saxon. But in Slavic lands, history moved differently. Instead of division, there was absorption. Instead of borders, overlap. Slavic DNA is filled with paradoxes. It is regional, yet shared. It is ancient, yet constantly shifting. It is homogeneous in patterns, but filled with microvariation under the surface. Geneticists have even measured this: a 4.3% variation between Slavic subgroups, far higher than the 1.2% seen within each one. That difference is real, but it doesn't fracture the identity. It enhances it. Look at Slovenia. Its people cluster genetically closer to Austrians than to Bulgarians, and yet they are Slavic. Look at Bulgaria, carrying Balkan, Turkic, even Greek layers, and still, the language, the culture, the blood carries the Slavic core. This isn't contradiction. It's complexity. It's proof that a shared identity doesn't require uniformity. It thrives in contrast, in blending, in history lived, not simplified. Because the Slavic genome is not a sealed chamber. It's an open cathedral, built stone by stone from the peoples it met, the lands it crossed, and the lives it merged with. And that cathedral still stands, in the DNA of over 300 million people today, whispering of farmers, warriors, traders, mothers, children, who never knew each other, yet share the same ancient foundation. It is one of the great ironies of Europe, that one of its most widespread identities was forged not in power, but in proximity. Slavic DNA is not a monolith. It is a living mosaic, vast, vibrant, unfinished. And through it, we see the truth. That identity is not purity. It is memory.